stories now, the chilly relationship between the United States and Russia really showing no signs of warming up, as President Putin calls Secretary of State John Kerry a liar, accusing him of downplaying the al-Qaeda influence in the Syrian opposition during his testimony before Congress. Take a listen to this.
I've watched debates in Congress. A congressman asked Mr. Kerry, is there al-Qaeda? People say they've gotten stronger. He says no. I say officially, they aren't there. The main combat unit, the so-called al-Nusra, is a unit of al-Qaeda. They know about this. It was not pleasant for me to see this. Well, we communicate with them and assume that they are decent people. He lies openly, and he knows that he lies. This is sad.
A strong statement. Maybe he's watching the testimony on Fox News, John.
I bet he is.
Who knew that President Putin was watching all of this? The State Department is releasing a statement in response to that. Obviously, a very deep criticism of Secretary Kerry. Here's what the State Department says, saying, quote, "This is certainly not the first time we've seen a visceral response from President Putin. Needless to say, the Secretary of State testified truthfully and accurately to Congress." So that's the end of that. Now, in the meantime, let's talk a little author of Mr. Putin. You can see the book cover there. She's also a senior fellow in the foreign policy program at the Brookings Institution. Fiona, nice to have you on the program with us today.
Thanks, Jenna.
So you've been in the position that President Obama has been in this way, that you've come face to face with President Putin. Just tell us a little bit about what he's like.
Well, President Putin is, as you might expect, he's a very cool and rather cold customer. I sat next to him a couple of times at dinner. Let's just say he doesn't engage in small talk, and he doesn't make you feel particularly very comfortable. And that's part of President Putin's modus operandi. He wants to keep people on edge and constantly guessing about what his intentions are and what he's going to do next.
What are his intentions when it comes to Syria? What's the end goal for Russia in all of this?
Well, his intentions are actually remarkably straightforward. He wants to prevent an international intervention in Syria. He doesn't see this as having any positive benefits for Russia whatsoever. He really thinks that a strike upon Syria could have a lot of really unfortunate consequences for Russia in its relationships with Syria itself and for its role more broadly in the Middle East, and potentially trigger off terrorist attacks against Russian territory.
Now, do you believe, because we've heard a lot of veiled talk between all sides, including our president, that the Russian president, seeing any sort of military intervention in Syria by the United States, would retaliate against us or help others retaliate?
It's a real question of what you mean about retaliation. I think Putin is going to be much more focused on preventing any kind of negative blowback against Russia. I don't think Putin is actually interested in taking part in a proxy war against the United States. In many respects, that already happened. That was in Georgia in 2008, when Putin himself drew a series of red lines about what he wanted to see in Georgia's relationships with NATO and with the outside world. And he really believed that the United States and Georgia and other actors had stepped over them. That's not what he's about in Syria. In Syria, he wants to keep the status quo. He doesn't want to see the Syrian state implode, although we would argue it already has imploded. He wants to make sure that whoever is in charge in Syria can keep further bad things from happening there.
You mentioned a proxy war, and we've heard that in conversations on our show before, that the Middle East is really just a playground, for lack of a better term, I know it's not a good one, between the United States and Russia for influence in the region. You don't see that, it seems, at this time. But who is the bigger influencer in the Middle East right now? Does Russia have the upper hand?
Russia doesn't have the upper hand in the Middle East. I mean, Russia is in a very strange position in the Middle East now. This is not the Cold War, and we have to recognize that right away. Russia's three remaining allies in the Middle East are actually three very odd bedfellows. In addition to Syria and the Assad regime, they're actually Iran and Israel, which may seem extraordinarily strange, and it makes it very difficult for Russian policy in the region. I mean, obviously, Israel does not have any kind of relationship with Iran and Syria that is not antagonistic. So there's been real shifts in the Middle East for Russia in terms of the relationships that they have there. And we're now seeing a whole host of new players in the Middle East, China, for example, and a whole shaking down of the old regimes in the Middle East. This is an area that's in constant flux. And Putin, looking forward, is very worried about what the Russian role in the Middle East is going to look like down the line. I mean, there are obviously still interests there. Russia actually wants to see some stability in the Middle East, just like everyone else.
Fiona,
but it's not really sure when the final accounting is done of where it's going to be.
Sure, and I don't mean to cut you off there, but I want to get to this last question, but you explain why it's so complicated with so many players on the stage in the Middle East. The cover of your book shows a lot of different, I don't know if it's costumes are the best term, or propaganda photos of President Putin, but we've all seen them of him riding bare-chested on a horseback and doing all these kind of crazy stunts. At least to us, it seems that way. And some have suggested that there is a chance for our president to communicate with the Russian president, but the question remains about how to do that. Does our president need to appear more like this? Fiona, would that make the Russian president respond better? What would actually bring Russia on our side?
President Putin, in spite of all these various guises that he's constantly assuming, has one major goal, one major persona for himself, as well as the protector and the defender of Russia. Ultimately, he wants to know, can President Obama guarantee what happens next in Syria? Does Obama know what the end game is going to be? And will that end game be beneficial to Russia? Now, that's a really difficult task for President Obama to engage in. Ironically, Putin doesn't want to see the political theatrics from President Obama in this particular case. He wants to know who's going to be in charge in the end of the day in Syria, and who's going to prevent anything bad from happening to Russia, and who is actually going to come through on all the various different deals that Russia has made with Assad over the last period of time. So he wants results, and he wants to know that Obama knows what he's doing in Syria.
Well, those questions sound very familiar to some questions that our lawmakers are asking here at home, as well as the American people. So we're going to continue to explore that question on the show today. Fiona, it's great to have you. Thank you so much for the time.
Thanks, Jenna. Thank you for having me. Thank you.